A game warden in Louisiana told me something in 2019 that I didn't believe until I tested it myself. He said that during his entire career from 1974 to 2003, the people who consistently caught the most fish in his jurisdiction weren't using lures. They weren't using live bait. They were using soap, not fancy soap, not scented soap. Plain white bath soap, the kind that costs $1 for a 4-pack at the grocery store. I thought he was exaggerating. I wasn't. His name was Curtis LeBlanc. He worked the waterways around Atchafalaya Basin for 29 years, checking fishing licenses and enforcing catch limits. He told me that every spring when the catfish started moving into the shallows, he'd see the same elderly Cajun fishermen anchored in the same spots, pulling in fish after fish, while the tournament boats with their $60,000 rigs came up empty. When he'd board their boats for inspections, he'd find no minnows, no chicken liver, no stink bait. Just a bar of ivory soap, sliced into cubes with a pocket knife, threaded onto circle hooks. Curtis said he asked one of them why soap worked. The man told him it was because soap is made from animal fat, and catfish can smell fat from half a mile downstream. I didn't test this in Louisiana. I tested it in a stocked pond in central Texas, then in a river in Arkansas, then in a reservoir in Oklahoma. 3 different ecosystems. Same result every time. Let me walk you through the chemistry first, because this isn't folklore. This is lipid biology. Ivory soap, the original formula introduced in 1879, is made from sodium tallowate. Tallowate is rendered beef fat that's been saponified with lye. The molecular structure consists of long-chain fatty acids, primarily stearic acid and palmitic acid, bound to sodium ions. When you submerge a cube of ivory soap in water, these chains begin to separate from the matrix at a rate determined by water temperature and current. In still water at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, a 1-inch cube of ivory will lose approximately 0.2 grams of mass per hour. That mass doesn't vanish. It dissolves into the water column as free fatty acids, creating a gradient plume that flows downstream or disperses outward depending on current. Catfish don't hunt by sight. Their eyes are functional, but in the muddy, tannin-stained rivers where they evolved, vision is almost useless below 3 feet of depth. Instead, they rely on olfaction and gustation, mediated by tens of thousands of taste buds distributed across their skin, barbels, and the interior of their mouths. These taste buds are tuned to detect amino acids, nucleotides, and lipids. Of those 3 categories, lipids produce the strongest feeding response because lipids indicate the presence of dead or dying prey. When a fish dies, its cell membranes rupture, releasing fatty acids into the water. Catfish have evolved to track these chemical signatures as a primary foraging strategy. When you put a cube of ivory soap on a hook and drop it into a river, you're not imitating prey. You're imitating decay. The soap releases a continuous stream of animal fat derivatives that catfish interpret as a carcass, and they move toward it with the same urgency they'd show for a dead shad or a drowned cricket. The first test was in a 1-acre pond stocked with channel catfish. I cut a fresh bar of ivory into 8 cubes, each roughly 1 inch on all sides. I used a size 2-0 circle hook, no weight, no bobber. I cast it 30 feet from the bank into 4 feet of water and let it sit on the bottom. At 11 minutes, I had a strike, not a nibble, a full commit. The fish inhaled the soap and hooked itself. I pulled in a 19-inch channel cat that weighed just over 3 pounds. I reset the hook with the same cube of soap, which had lost maybe a quarter of its mass. 8 minutes later, I had another fish. In 90 minutes, I caught 6 catfish using 2 cubes of soap. Total cost, 25 cents. The second test was in the Illinois River in eastern Oklahoma, a system with heavy boat traffic and moderate current. I used the same setup but added a 1/2-ounce slip sinker to keep the soap anchored near the bottom. The current carried the scent plume downstream, creating a scent corridor roughly 15 feet wide and 200 feet long, based on dye tests I ran the day before using food coloring. I positioned myself at the upstream end of a deep hole where catfish were known to stage during midday heat. I let the rig settle, then I waited. At 14 minutes, I had a blue catfish on the line. At 22 minutes, another. At 41 minutes, a flathead that bent my rod into a parabola and stripped 30 yards of line before I could turn it. I didn't land the flathead. It broke me off on a submerged log. But the fact that it struck soap at all is significant because flatheads are ambush predators that typically ignore dead bait. The third test was the one that convinced me Curtis wasn't embellishing. I fished a community reservoir in Arkansas that had been heavily pressured the previous weekend during a catfish derby. Over 200 anglers had fished the same water for 12 hours straight using prepared baits, live shad, and cut bait. The fish had seen everything. They were conditioned to avoid hooks. I arrived at dawn 2 days after the event. I used Ivory soap exclusively. No backup bait. No plan B. In 4 hours, I caught 11 catfish between 12 and 24 inches. The largest was a 27-inch blue that weighed 8 pounds. I caught it on a cube of soap that had been in the water for over an hour and had degraded to roughly half its original size, but was still firm enough to stay on the hook. During that same 4-hour window, I watched 3 other anglers fishing within 50 yards of my position. They were using commercial stink baits in porous tubes and sponges. I saw one of them land a single fish. The other 2 packed up early. Now let me explain why this method has been suppressed. The commercial catfish bait industry generates over $120 million annually in the United States. Companies like Berkeley, Team Catfish, and Magic Bait sell products that are engineered to create scent plumes using fish oils, blood meal, and synthetic amino acids. These baits are packaged in jars, tubes, and resealable bags, and they're marketed with the same language you see in every other fishing category: proprietary formulas, fish-attracting technology, tournament-proven results. A bar of Ivory soap costs 25 cents and contains the same core attractant, sodium tallowate, that catfish have been responding to since before the bait industry existed. Curtis told me that in the 1970s and 80s, soap fishing was common knowledge among subsistence anglers in the South. People who fished to eat, not for sport. They didn't have money for bait shops. They used what worked, and soap worked because it was cheap, abundant, and shelf-stable. But as the sport fishing industry professionalized and tournament circuits emerged, soap disappeared from the conversation. It wasn't advertised. It wasn't sold in tackle shops. It wasn't featured in magazines or on fishing shows. It became invisible, not because it stopped working, but because no one could monetize it. I'm not romanticizing poverty. I'm documenting efficacy. The footage I recorded shows fish after fish committing to a hook, baited with a household product that predates modern fishing by 80 years. The strikes are clean, the hook sets are solid, the fish don't hesitate. I used a $40 rod, 12-pound monofilament, and soap that I bought in the same aisle as toilet paper. I didn't use a boat, I didn't use sonar, I didn't use bait that requires refrigeration. Curtis retired in 2003. He told me that toward the end of his career, he stopped seeing soap fishermen. The younger generation had been taught that fishing required technology, that success was a function of equipment investment. He said the old men who taught him about soap were all dead now, and their methods died with them. This is one of those methods. The chemistry is sound. The results are repeatable. The cost is 25 cents per fishing session.